All right. Everyone doing okay today? I can't see all of your faces, so I'll just assume you guys are doing fantastic. Let me just move my screen. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you guys for joining us. We're gonna send this out onto the AudBoss page and probably some other pages as well, just to get this content out because I think this is something that we've been talking about doing for a very long time, and only recently, after having a conversation with our guest today, did we come up with this idea of actually having a conversation about, financials and, valuations and even selling your practice and strategies with selling your practice. So thank you guys for being here. Lot of good information. I met Monil a couple years back, and he was in the industry doing a lot of work with a company called Alpaca, which was, as some of you know, transitioned or sold to Sonova, and we had met, and I knew right away this guy was a very smart guy. He knows his numbers more so than I do, and I thought I was pretty good with numbers. So I was excited to invite him here. He's somebody that I really respect a lot. He's been doing a lot of practice sales and acquisitions, even currently with his new company. He set off on his own, started his new company called Tortoise Finance. And he's worked with many practices. I've actually recommended him to a handful of audiologists who are looking to sell their practices as well. So before we dive in, a couple quick notes. We're going to try to keep this interactive, but I don't want to trip Monal up. So Monal, if you're okay, why don't we leave the Q&A to the end, if that's okay with you? Unless, yeah, okay, perfect. So folks, if you don't mind, I'm not going to mute everybody. So if you're not muted, Sarah, I don't think you're muted. If you don't mind, I can't hear anything from you, but I just want to let you know that it doesn't show mute on my side. That's okay. So why don't we'll just hammer this out, and at the very end we'll open it up for Q&A. You can I'll monitor the chat, so when Monal's talking, I'll kind of monitor the chat, and periodically, if there are questions that need to be answered right away, I'll pose some questions. I did mention that the session is being recorded, and I will send the link out later so you can watch it again or share it to whoever you want to share it to. And then, of course, Monal's going to give us a lot of great content to be able to use right away. So Monal, why don't we just jump right in? Tell us why we're doing this. Why are practice sales happening more frequently? What do people need to know about their businesses? And why don't I just give it to you if you can introduce yourself and go from there, please.
Absolutely. Hey, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon. Am I loud and clear? Okay, awesome. Hey, thanks so much, everyone, for jumping on. Good to see a couple of familiar faces and names. Um, my name's Monil. I am the managing partner of a company called Tortoise Finance. We're a mergers and acquisitions advisory firm. Basically, what that means is we help practice owners and practice buyers find each other and come up with a fair transaction. Ahmed, thank you for having me, and everyone, thank you for the opportunity today. I think a couple things we'd love to do. One. We put together the sample P&L of an example audiology company. Would love to walk you through what that looks like and use that as an example for to talk about factors that may help increase or decrease a practice's valuation. Talk about how a buyer looks at a practice. Um, and also importantly, want to maybe share with everyone a couple of ways that you yourselves could look to increase the valuation of your practice, whether you look to transact today or years from now, I think could be helpful at any point in time. Um, unless Amit, you have anything else, I'm happy to go ahead and share my screen, unless you want to go ahead and do that.
I was thinking maybe you should share your screen so you can kind of move it around
Yes,
because there's a few pages. So
absolutely.
I just gave you permission.
Thank you. Let me know when that's visible.
We can see it.
Okay, awesome. Um, I think a couple of things we'll talk through today. So what you're looking at in front of you today on your screen right now, it's called the profit and loss statement. I don't want to presume somebody knows what I'm talking about. Let me know if you want me to speed through anything. Um, what we're looking at in front of us is called a profit and loss or income statement. We'll talk about the pieces that encompass that. We're going to talk a little bit about what this translates into in terms of evaluation. We'll talk about different buyer types and multiples that practices of different sizes can expect to see in the market today. Um, uh, let's go through this P&L first. Basically, what an income statement does is it tells us, either a practice owner, buyer, viewer, what it tells us is how much money was generated by a business over a certain period of time. Um, it is often over a 12-month period. Um, and often you might think it's on a calendar year 12-month period, meaning January 1st through December 31st. And of course, that's important. And of course, the buyer will want to look at that. In fact, they'll want to look at a couple of years at a time. But also, there's a term we want to talk about. It's called trailing 12 months. What it means is the most recent 12-month period. That is also important. If you look at this in front of you, we're talking about ABC ideology. We're in August right now. So anything that's happened between January and July of this year, a buyer also cares about. So we want to look at different 12-month periods. Um, the first section up here is called revenue, which is basically how much money comes in through the door. It can come in through different forms for different reasons, but that's what revenue is. Uh, Below that, you'll see something called cost of goods sold, COGS or COGS. In our industry, what COGS is really what's the cost of the inputs of doing business. So for us, it's really what is the cost of hearing aids. Below that, you'll see something called operating expenses or OpEx. And what these are the other expenses that we as a practice owner might incur. Think things like employees or rent or marketing that also go into generating this revenue or generating this cash. And at this very bottom section, we'll talk about profit and this term, this magical word, EBITDA, and what that really means and why that matters to us today. Um, we'll start at the top. So this example company, ABC Audiology, uh, I've assumed it to be generating $1 million in revenue. Um, of this $1 million in revenue, you'll notice there are three buckets that revenue is generated from: hearing aid sales, third-party administration or third-party fittings or managed care, and then a catch-all, all other bucket. Think diagnostics, hearing tests, ear molds, and such. Uh, when you think about a buyer, right? What do they care about? They care about um, dollars and profitability. Hearing aids happen to be oftentimes the most profitable piece of an audiology practice. What's nice in this case is that a majority of revenue, 75% of it, is generated from hearing aid sales. That's often looked at favorably. Um, the question a buyer will ask, though, is this revenue generated on existing patients? or is it on new patients that haven't come to us before? So that's important to talk about. Um, Below that, you see $150,000, which is 15% of the business's revenues generated by third-party fittings and managed care. As you know better than me, super important piece of the puzzle for you to operate a practice, just as important for a buyer when they're evaluating one. What they want to know is, has third-party penetration increased or decreased for you over the years? Is it at a stable level now? Meaning, if you look at the last couple of years, were we at, call it somewhere between 10 and 15%? Or has it increased materially in recent times? And if so, why? Simultaneously, buyers often want to learn, um, does the practice have a conscious, proactive strategy around showing the value proposition of coming in as a private pay patient instead of a third-party patient? Or is it sort of, hey, patient walks in through the door, we'll take them as are? Uh, there's no right or wrong answer, but those are some of the questions that a buyer cares about when they look at third-party revenues. Uh, Last but not least, you've got diagnostics. What's nice about it is, or any other types of revenue, what's nice about it is uh, what this means is that this practice is audiology focused, it's audiology forward, which is always a good thing. Um, but dollars per hour of time spent uh, is sometimes lower than that uh, compared to hearing aid sales. So you just want to be mindful of how much time is spent pursuing or generating um, uh, revenue from non-hearing aid sales. For good or bad, that's in some ways the reality of how the practice buyers look at practices. And of course, overall, um, anybody will care about, has this revenue amount increased, decreased, stayed stable over the years? Um, let's switch over to the next section here, cost of goods sold. Um, Look at this row right here, hearing aid cost of goods sold divided by hearing aid revenue. What that's saying is that it costs us about 30%. Our COGS are 30%. If you sell a hearing aid for $1,000, it's costing you about 300 bucks. Um, Buyers care about this a whole lot. Um, a couple different things they'll question and want to understand. So one, have you already negotiated really, really attractive, profitable rates with manufacturers? Or is there upside that a buyer can generate because they have better contracts with manufacturers? Uh, do we sell low margin, low tech level products? Do we sell a good mix of high, tech level 4 or 5 products? Um, do we have a low, medium, high average sales price, an ASP? Because that'll determine whether the buyer has an ability to increase it or not. Uh, then, of course, most importantly, uh, will your team and you be willing to switch manufacturers if it came to it? There's no easy answer there, and it's not always necessary for you to switch manufacturers. But imagine a scenario in which you fit manufacturer A's products, your team is comfortable with manufacturer A's products, but a buyer that you really like and trust fits manufacturer B's products. One way that they can justify uh, paying a high multiple and valuing the practice highly is through an improvement in cost of goods sold that they get to experience. And so sometimes you are asked to consider switching products. That's a consideration. Um, you see this, we'll continue onwards. Um, when you take this revenue number, the dollars that have come in, and subtract out the cost of goods sold, you're left with about $725,000 of what's called gross profit. So these are basically the dollars you have to play with to actually operate your day-to-day business. Uh, when you look at your own profit and loss statements, you'll see a whole bunch of rows in addition to this. All we've done here is consolidate some of these rows just so it's easier for us to navigate. Uh, maybe the number one uh, most expensive portion of running the business is personnel, is yourself and your team. Um, Generally, on average, I would say that audiology practices are roughly between 30 and 35, 40% of, 30 to 35% of a practice's revenues are spent on labor. That'll, of course, vary based on geography, based on um, how quickly you could replace a provider if you so needed to. And also, like how 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 long providers have been with you. That'll also, of course, matter. Um, so I'm not saying that necessarily having a low labor cost is a good thing. All I'm saying is it depends. You just want to be able to explain why. Uh, when a buyer looks at that labor cost, they care, of course, about how much revenue each provider is generating. Is there revenue concentrated with any particular provider? Uh, Folks care about, has there been a bunch of turnover? Uh, have employees come in and out? And if so, why? If there's a story, if there's a reason, if an individual had to move because their spouse found a job in a different city versus uh, um, you had to let them go for some other reason, that matters. Not necessarily a negative thing. You just want to be able to explain the why. Um, Buyers will care about what portion of this payroll goes towards paying a provider's cash compensation versus commission. Uh, because buyers want folks to be incentivized to generate more revenue. If an employee is 100% paid cash without any commission, the buyer will question, hey, are they incentivized? Are they bought in? And they may be. You just want to be able to explain it. Uh, and of course, the buyer will care about will um, a commission or a compensation structure change with the buyer. Uh, Oftentimes, buyers are larger entities than sellers, and so benefits often end up being more attractive to employees, but that's something to think about. Uh, let's look at the next row here, occupancy. Um, this is primarily rent that you end up paying for your clinics. So what do buyers care about? They care about how much revenue is generated at each clinic, and each clinic independently profitable, independently of the entire organization. Um, you can have a scenario in which you have a primary clinic and then a satellite or two. Now, if the satellites are marginally profitable, but they take up a lot of time and headache, then the buyer will question, is there a reason to keep them as is, or is there a way to consolidate them? You might say, no, there's a reason why. There are these physicians who refer patients to us, or we want to maintain a good rapport with the senior center. There may be a reason why, but you just want to be able to explain it. Uh, A buyer will question if there's a low profitability or if a clinic is unprofitable. Is there a long-term lease in place, or can they, that they could terminate and consolidate into a different location? Um, or are you sort of stuck in that location for a period of time? Also worth noting, if you as an owner, a practice owner, also own the physical location, the real estate, the buyer will look to oftentimes enter into a long-term lease with you post a sale. And so they'll ask, is the rent that you charge the business fair market value, or is it not? And that'll affect go forward profitability. Um, the next bucket here is marketing. Uh, I would say somewhere in the 6 to 8% of revenues of a marketing cost is fairly uh, average for audiology practices. Some a little more, some a little less, depending on what kind of marketing is effective for you. But that would be maybe the number one question. Is the type of marketing you're spending time and effort behind effective for you? Is there a lot of spend on marketing, or is there upside for the buyer to invest some dollars there? And also importantly, how well do we, um, for lack of a better word, mine our database? Meaning, are we reaching out to patients who came in and purchased a pair of hearing aids from us 3 years ago or 5 years ago? And if we are not, is that opportunity for the buyer to capitalize on? Uh, Last but not least is this catch-all, all other bucket. So imagine basically everything else, things like billing, accounting, uh, certain benefits, and you want the buyer will want to understand, will these expenses go away because they have some kind of a central office that will absorb this, or will they also continue to experience a similar level of cost? Because you can imagine a scenario in which a buy you currently pay a CPA. Uh, the buyer will no longer need to continue paying a CPA for every single clinic, but maybe they have an accounting team that they have to hire and pay for. So it may not be that the cost goes away, it may just get reallocated elsewhere. Okay, zooming out for a moment, basically you take these dollars that have come in as revenue and you subtract out all of these expenses. And you come up with this line item called net income, or it's really a measure of profit. How much cash, how much money is left over in your business after all is said and done. Now, this is certainly an important figure, but it is not the only one important to us. Um, because uh, there's a little bit of call it a juggling act that we have to do to get from this profit number to what the practice's true profit is. I'll explain what I mean. Let's suppose this is ABC Audiology, and the owner of ABC Audiology has a loan with the manufacturer that they're paying off every year. Now, as part of the loan payments, repayments, you're also making interest payments. That is affecting negatively your bottom line. So, versus, let's suppose there was a practice uh, performing very similarly at a very similar revenue level, also generating $1 million of revenue, also structured the same way, but they don't have any loan payments because it's fully paid off. The owner owns 100% of the business. That owner doesn't have to pay anything towards interest. That owner's profit will look like it's higher than owner number one, when in fact they may be generating the same amount of profit. So what I'm saying is there are some adjustments that we have to make to try to compare two practices apples to apples, um, and be able to value two practices apples to apples. This term EBITDA, right? That's what we're trying to calculate. What does EBITDA mean? It stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. What it's saying is before you experience any of these expenses, how much profit does your business generate? In addition to those things, you also identify what are called personal or one-time expenses. And we'll get into that in just one second. Okay, I'll give you a couple of examples of what each of these terms mean. So we have something concrete to think about. So take that interest payment making entity, right? It's experienced $20,000 of interest expense in this year. But in reality, if a buyer buys this business all cash and will no longer need to make any interest payments, the buyer will not make $109,000 of profit in a year. The buyer will instead make $129,000 of profit in a year. Let me know if that doesn't make sense. Similarly, you have something called depreciation that has to do with equipment. Speaking of equipment, the buyer will also care about will they have to refurbish the clinic with new equipment. But let's say you have these interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization line items that your business experiences. You basically get a credit for them when we try to normalize profit. When we try to calculate EBITDA, you get a credit for them because whether or not you have a loan with a manufacturer doesn't really determine how you operate the business and is it a successfully operated business. In addition to these things, uh, most practice owners run what are called personal expenses through the business. Think things like a personal cell phone or a personal car lease. These are expenses that will not continue with the buyer going forward. A buyer is no longer going to continue paying your family cell phone plan. Um, while that's maybe not great because you'll have to pay out of pocket, what is nice is that at this moment in time, you get credit for it in calculating your EBITDA. So I'll give you an example. Let's suppose in the last 12 months, you spent $15,000 of the business's money towards a personal car payment. The business looks like it's $15,000 less profitable than it will really be going forward. So you get a credit for $15,000. So instead of $109,000, really you're generating $124,000. In addition to these personal expenses that won't continue going forward, imagine one-time type expenses. Imagine things that don't occur every year. Something like an HVAC system in your clinic broke down and there was a $5,000 bill associated to repair it. Now, that's not something that the buyer will incur every year, and that's the argument we have to make to them. And so we have to ask for that credit, and that'll help increase our true profitability. There are a couple things that might decrease our profitability and negatively impact us. Let's suppose you own the clinic, but you undercharge the practice for rent. Let's suppose you charge the practice $2,500 a month, but really the space next door would charge $3,000 a month. After you sell the business, you're going to charge the buyer fair market value for that space. So really, the business is underpaying rent by $500 a month. And so going forward, the buyer will incur $6,000 more in rental income and thus your profitability will be negatively impacted. It's not a bad thing because you'll get those rental payments, but it's just something to be aware of when understanding how much profit does my business really generate. And then another common potential negative impact is if you pay yourself a higher salary than uh, you would get if you went and got employed by this business, or if you had to hire yourself out of the business, what would it cost to replace you? If that amount is going to be lower, then you're overpaying yourself. And so the buyer will knock EBITDA down a little bit for that amount. When all is said and done, when all these pluses and minuses take place, this business is not generating $109,000. Really, it's generating $165,000 because there are all these personal items. There's these interest payments in here. There are these one-time type payments in here. So when you talk to a buyer, really your business is generating $165,000 of profit. And when you're able to communicate that, that helps in a big way when talking about valuation. Let me pause there for a minute. Amit, are there any relevant questions we should?
Yeah, so thank you. And I want to be mindful of time here, so I want to go through these real quick. Rebecca had a question, and I think I know the answer, but I'll let you answer. Is it important to separate out the revenue types if you run a cash business versus accrual? And same question for COGS.
Uh, I would say 90+% of audiology practices operate on a cash basis, which and it is not a problem. A buyer understands and acknowledges that. Oftentimes, buyers themselves also operate on a cash basis. Uh, it is super helpful to be able to separate out revenue types. But let's suppose that you don't track that in QuickBooks, for example. There are some workarounds. Your EMR system, maybe use Cycle, maybe use Blueprint. Uh, your EMR system will sometimes help us um, circumnavigate to that. But it is helpful to a buyer because they do care about how much revenue is generated from high profit services versus low profit margin services.
Thank you. And so I always use the term owner's discretionary earnings. I know you're using the term add backs. And are there other like ODEs or add backs that, some people may not think about? Because I know that when in our practice, I run a lot of add backs through the practice.
Absolutely. Think travel, right? There's a bunch of instances in which you are not traveling to a conference, or you are traveling to a conference for 2 days, but tacking on a 3-day vacation to the back end of it. Um, those 3 days, that expense incurred during those 3 days, anything that's personal or one time in nature, if you can identify it, you can get credit for it. If you can get credit for it, you can justify asking for a higher valuation. Um, I'd say travel is a big one.
Mhm.
Sometimes we see things like golf course fees, or uh, it just really is all over the place. A boat lease, really dependent on practice. These are some of the common ones I'd say.
Yeah, I was just in Napa just a couple weeks ago. All business, of course. Okay, let's move on to the next section because I know we want to get this done in about 30 minutes. So, Mona, why don't we go on to uh, like multiples if you want to jump into that topic, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, let's use this practice as an example to talk about how a buyer would value it and how you would actually get paid. So just the two numbers for us to keep in mind are $1 million of revenue and $165,000 of EBITDA or normalized profit. Okay. In my best guess for how a buyer would value this business is roughly one times revenue, give or take a little bit. It might be a little bit less, maybe as low as 0.8x, which means about $800,000. It might be as much as 1.2x, which could be $1.2 million. I know I'm giving you a wide range, but I know we spoke about some of the factors that play into this. But I'm assuming that this buyer will make an offer for $1 million. That's a 1x multiple on the business's revenues. Now, oftentimes, this $1 million offer is not paid all as cash at close. Uh, a buyer is hesitant to pay all of it at close because they take on a little bit of risk. What happens if you walk away the day after the dotted line is signed? So there are different ways for them to break up how they pay dollars out. So in this case, I'm assuming that the buyer will pay 75% of proceeds as cash at close and 25% of proceeds as what's called an earnout. This breakdown is fairly common, I would say. Like a 70-30 split, 80-20 split is a fairly common and in many ways fair and reasonable and what you'd expect the market to pay. Um, what is an earnout? An earnout basically asks you to stay on. In most instances, asks you to stay on. In a minority instances, you can walk away, but this business still has to perform. But basically, what the earnout is asking is for you to ensure that the business continues to generate the same amount of revenue that it has done so far. So if it generated $1 million over the last 12 months, the buyer is saying that if you continue generating $1 million, I'll go ahead and pay this earnout out to you. Uh, Sometimes it's over 1 year. So you get 75% as cash at close and 25% 12 months from then, um, assuming that revenues hold steady. Sometimes an earnout might be done over 2 years, and that $250,000 is really split out over year one and year two. And you have to generate that revenue both in year one and in year two. Uh, Sometimes this is called an earnout. There are a couple other things that buyers will use. They'll use something called seller financing, which is basically you, the practice owner, seller, um, making a loan to the buyer. It may be for a portion of the purchase price, but basically they'll pay that back to you over an agreed amount period of time, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, 5 years. Uh, Sometimes it's neither of these. It's what's called equity or go forward minority ownership in the business. Let's suppose you retain 10% of the business, 20% of the business going forward as a minority owner. You can get what's called a profit distribution on a, every 6 month or every 12-month basis for the ownership percentage you own in the business. Basically, the buyer will try to do anything they can to incentivize you to stay on in some capacity or the other, either as an active participant in the business or an inactive, but still some strings attached participant in the business. Let's suppose you are continuing on with the business for a certain period of time. You also get compensation along with and separate from the purchase price of the business. Because you are not working for that earnout piece when you're treating patients, you're really working for a salary as well simultaneously. And maybe you're treating patients, maybe you're managing the business and mentoring your team. It could really be dependent on you and the specific buyer you end up partnering with. Uh, this is roughly how I would expect this business to be valued. Um, Unless Amit, you want me to pause, I'll switch over to the different buyer types.
Yeah, actually, I have a question. So you're using the the multiple off of the gross revenue, is that correct?
That
So
is correct.
yeah, I've seen, I mean, I'm sure it's different with every buyer, but I've seen the multiples go from the net income or EBITDA versus the gross revenue because the gross revenue could be, very overvalued, right? Or overstated. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. So imagine there are two practices both generating $1 million of revenue. All revenue dollars are not made equal. There's a practice that's super tech forward, uh, super efficient, has really good COGS, has a lot of profit at the bottom line, is what I'm getting to.
Mhm.
There's a different practice that's imagine third party heavy and thus you need a lot more provider time to generate that same $1 million of revenue. And thus you need a lot more expense to generate that same $1 million of revenue. So you could be a materially different profit generating entity, even if you generate the same amount of revenue. And a buyer will value those two different businesses differently from each other. They will not both get the same multiple. Um, I'm shying away from being more specific about how that business would get valued. Uh, and when an EBITDA multiple or net income multiple is relevant or valid versus not. Because you could have a large practice that's inefficiently run, and a buyer is willing to pay one times revenue for that, even if it's generating $0 in profit. Because what it gives the buyer is an ability to really fix up a lot of different practices at once and really materially increase profitability. Uh, I think maybe the way to put it is if you imagine the go forward scenario, what will the profit of the business? It's sometimes called pro forma. You'll hear that term pro forma, which really means what will the go forward uh, profit and loss statement look like for the business? That's really what matters more than historical, because in scenario A, a buyer makes some minor operational changes or has really materially better cost of goods sold, and they can really considerably increase the profitability of business A. And those are low-hanging fruit, and you get a lot of bang for your buck, basically. In scenario two, in that third-party heavy company or a company that's really a turnaround situation, you're really building the clinic from scratch. It's not super easy operationally to improve the profitability of that business. So even going forward, the profitability will be low, even if the buyer has really good cost of goods sold, even if the buyer can hire and replace and retain talent. Um, in this example, I'm using this one times revenue multiple, but it really is a range, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
And then I think I have a second point that I always get nervous on on the uh the earnout and the earn not so much the earnout, but the earnout with the stipulation that the revenue needs to stay, at the same rate. Because that after, you're the owner, you're the one that has put this passion in and you generated the $1 million revenue. Once you've sold, sometimes the policies or procedures have changed and now it's harder to hit that $1 million mark, or the marketing has changed, or sometimes they bring in these experts who come in and do these they're closers who come in, and sometimes that doesn't work. So there's a lot of horror stories out there. There's a lot of success stories as well, but that's just kind of a point that I always get nervous about if there's some kind of a minimum requirement.
Thank you for calling that out, Amit. Yes, these dollars are not made the same, right?
Yeah.
This $750,000 you can count on
Yep.
because it will show up on your bank account the day of close. The earnouts are a little bit of a gamble.
Yep.
Um, and it's a little broader conversation, but I just second what Amit just said.
Yeah. And then Frank actually made a good point, and I think you're going to talk about it in the next section, but he says, can you please talk about the different types of buyers and what type of multiples are seen for each buyer? I have
Perfect.
bought many practices and never paid more than 0.5x sales. So,
Absolutely. No, perfect. Thank you
yes. Okay.
for that. Okay. Um, I've tried to summarize. So in my view, there are three, I try to categorize buyers. I have categorized buyers into three buckets. Um, Manufacturers or large independent groups. Imagine a group that has 50 or more clinics. Um, you all will know many of those names and recognize many of those names, wherever you are in the country. Then you've got regional or local practices. Imagine a 3 to 5 clinic practice that's within a 2 or 3 hour drive time of yours. Maybe they're looking to expand their footprint to where you are, or maybe you're a market leader and they've never been able to win in your zip code, and they'd love to partner with you and acquire your business to add to their umbrella. Um, and then last but not least, you have either an employee who works for you today. Maybe there's an audiologist who works for you today. You want to consider selling the practice to her or him. Or you have individuals who are providers in that same maybe drive time. They may be an employee provider elsewhere, but looking to enter into private practice ownership. And instead of starting a practice from scratch, they may be interested in acquiring a business and building off of the legacy you've built. Um, I think there are some pros and cons worth considering and thinking through for each of these types of buyers. Um, I think genuinely none is definitively the right one or the wrong one. There are just considerations with each. Um, you can imagine a large manufacturer or a large entity being willing and able to pay um, uh, a higher valuation than a smaller entity, because for them, cost of goods sold is very, very low. Um, Regional practices, they sometimes still have to borrow money from a manufacturer or from a private bank. So for them, I would say valuation is probably middle of the range. Uh, for either an employee or an individual practitioner elsewhere, usually you see valuations offered from them being towards the lower end of that range. Um, Only because they're not able to borrow as much. That goes hand in hand with financing timeline. This is actually a super important piece because anybody can make you an offer, but the question that you want to answer is, can this entity actually get it done? Will this entity drag its feet? Will they walk back on their offer? Will they actually transact with me? In many instances, manufacturers uh, are able to finance quickly because they have cash on hand, or large entities have cash on hand, so they're able to finance quickly. Though maybe I should have added an extra row here for how long it takes them to get a deal done, and that's probably a negative on larger groups. It oftentimes takes manufacturers the longest to get a deal done. Regional practices. Um, they sometimes have to borrow money, sometimes they're funding themselves. So I would say middle of the pack. Individuals will have to either borrow money from the manufacturer or the SBA in many instances. They'll have to come up with an agreement with the manufacturer. And so it'll sometimes take them a little bit longer than the other types of entities to get funding secured. Um, However, they may be able to move more quickly because they don't have to go through hoops of approval processes um, to actually make an offer and get a deal done. Uh, Larger entities often have the experience of doing transactions and being aware ahead of time what kinds of things can pop up, can come up. So, for example, what do you do if an employee of the selling entity says, "Hey, I am uncomfortable signing a non-compete with you, the buyer"? How do you navigate that conversation? Large entities who've done transactions many times over have sometimes the approach in place or are able to have a conversation with them that they've thought through and tested before, are able to provide references for either employees or owners to talk to because they've done deals before. I would say sizable local practices, even as small as three, not that 3 to 5 practices is small, but even 3 to 5 practices, opening up one clinic, let alone two or three, is very, very difficult. And so that practice owner has the experience of opening new clinics or acquiring smaller clinics. Um, and so that experience oftentimes works in their favor. Because an individual often hasn't done an acquisition before, they can sometimes get tripped up over the process or how long something will take. Uh, but that's really because they don't have the experience, not because they're not looking to do right by you. Uh, Larger entities will often have a dedicated team and process in place. They'll give you a timeline ahead of time. Here's what you can expect from us over these next 90 days. Here's what's going to happen in week one, week two, week three. Uh, Regional practices don't often have that team in place, but they do have a process because they've sometimes done this before. Um, Individuals may not have done this before. And really, they're either treating for your practice full time, simultaneously trying to do a transaction with you. The same as you, right? You're probably managing a practice full time and trying to do a transaction simultaneously. So you don't have dedicated manpower to focus just on a transaction. And there's not a big negative there. It's just it takes a little more time and effort. That's what I'm trying to say. Uh, of course, last but not least, that private practice feel, the culture, the know-how of what does the local community look like? What do patients in the local community respond to? Uh, there's no better person oftentimes than you, your employee providers, um, uh, to know that local field and be able to continue providing that local field going forward. Oftentimes, the uh, downside of going with a larger entity is they are a little more rigid and they are a little bit more prescriptive in what they ask for, how a clinic is run. It is not always the case, but it is often. And so it's a clear win for an individual buyer or an employee buyer uh, in this case. Uh, I'll pause here. The only slide left, Amit, is a range of
Yep.
valuations.
Yep.
I can
Yep.
put that up unless you want to.
Yeah, one question Sarah asked, anyone going for employee ownership trust option or too risky? Seems like for larger practices, it's a toss-up between buyers who can afford the practice versus retaining that personal feel. Do you see multi-location practices selling off individual clinics, almost like a franchise model?
Both perfect, both really good questions. Honestly, timely. Um, we're in the middle of a couple of processes in which the employee is a potential buyer. So one way, so there are some pros and cons. So yes, a little bit risky because that individual doesn't have financing in place, hasn't done this before. But if you don't have a time pressure, then you can encourage that employee to get started and give them a timeline. Like, look, I'd love to transact in the next 12 months. I'll give you the first 3 months, the first 4 months to put something together and come to me with a proposal. If this is fair versus what I would get in the market, then I'd love nothing more than to work with you directly and not bring somebody else into the conversation. Uh, but I do have to transact in 12 months. So what does that mean? If we are unable to get to an agreement in 4 months, then respectfully, I'll have to bring in other potential partners. There's nothing stopping that employee from being a part of that process as well. What's the value prop of this auction process? It's really you have a lot of parties at the table in front of you simultaneously. Of course, you're able to get a better valuation because each party wants to be the winning bid. But also, you get to understand the intangibles and the qualitative pieces. So, in a couple of recent conversations we've had, the employee didn't want to continue with the same manufacturer, but a buyer was willing to do that. A buyer would keep all of the clinics together, and there would not need to be a separation of which patients in our database belong to clinic A versus clinic B versus clinic C. That is a complication. It's something we can overcome, but it's tricky because, hey, my clinics are 20 miles from each other. How do you decide exactly where that 10-mile radius is? How do you decide, well, this patient sometimes comes to this clinic, sometimes comes to that clinic? It also means you have to go through two individual transactions. One transaction can take 6 to 9 months. If you do it in um, a smart way, if you approach it, it can take 6 months, it can take 9 months. Um, So imagine going through both two sets of legal documents, two sets of non-competes, uh, two sets of potential earnouts that you have to make. Um, so it can get complicated. But also we're working on a different process right now in which an employee is a potential buyer, and we're coming up with what the fair valuation of the business would be from the get-go. And the employee is willing to offer that valuation. So there is a potential way to get the best of both worlds. And in that case, the employee is buying the whole practice, and is able to buy the whole practice. It's not always the case. Um, but there is, there's no guarantee transaction hasn't completed. Uh, but there is a way to structure it so that you get, call it somewhere between the 90th and 100th percentile of what you think the practice is worth. Simultaneously, you're able to sell to somebody who you know and trust and believe can do a good job. I know we're running short on time, but one important piece, when you as a practice owner are managing the business, you're providing a lot of mentorship and management oversight that the uh, employee doesn't have a full grasp of just off the bat. So you just want to make sure that they do, um, if you end up transacting with them, so that you aren't committing to staying on to continue managing the administrative side of the house. Uh, I'm going to go ahead and just put this table up on your screen. I won't say all of these numbers out loud. If you ask me what the valuation range of businesses of different sizes should be, could be, or can be, I would say roughly this is what that range can be. Um, it can mean needing multiple buyers at the table. It can mean taking proceeds partially as an earnout or partially as equity. But this is roughly what I would say is assuming everything else makes sense about a business. This is roughly what I think the average business could get valued at today. Please take it with a grain of salt.
Everything's a negotiation, right? Mona, are you wrapping up? Is that
That is it on my end. I'll pause right there. I know we're at the hour.
Yeah. No, this is awesome. Like I said in the beginning, this is something that, I've been wanting to do for a long time within the AudBoss realm and then, even just outside of it. So this was fantastic, Monil. And uh I put in the chat Monil's contact information and his website. So if you didn't see that, if you can go back in the chat, you can find that information. Again, I recommend Monil and his team to numerous audiologists, and I've worked with many different folks in this realm, and I couldn't be happier with the work that Monil and his team do. So I highly endorse him, and he will be at the Odd Boss Summit. So if you guys are going to be there, I know Frank and Craig and a couple of you that are on are going to be there, and Mona will be there with a booth, and so you can connect with him there. Mona, is there anything else you want to share with the audience before we wrap up here?
But exactly what Amit said. Thank you everyone for your time. Would be great to hear from you, whether you look to transact today or years from now. Always happy to chat.
Excellent. And any questions from anybody? I know we're at the hour, but if anybody has any questions, this would be the time to ask.
Thanks, guys. It's super informative. Even though I jumped in and out, I did pay attention, so don't yell at me.
I've got the video footage.
Monel, thank you. Good to see you again, buddy.
Pleasure's mine, Craig. It's really nice to see you.
You guys are neighbors, right? Almost right in New York.
I think so.
Almost.
That part of the world, you guys are all neighbors, I think. So,
Great session. Really appreciate it, though. Thank you for putting it together.
Very, very kind of you.
all right, folks. So I don't see any questions coming in. I'm going to go ahead and Frank, I'll post it on the Oddboss page, and I'll probably post it on LinkedIn as well. But like, give me a couple hours to get it downloaded and then uploaded to YouTube, and then put the link up. So if anybody wants a copy, you can find us there, and I'll email it, Mono, of course, to you. Um, and if you guys are catching us from anywhere else, let me know, and I'll be happy to share it there as well. Good. All
Thank you,
right. Well,
everyone.
I think that's it. All right, folks. Thanks for being here. Monal, thank you again. We'll talk to you guys later. Have a good day.